The proportion of Jews in the Communist Party Bolshevik by 1922, 13%, was certainly higher than their proportion in Soviet Ukraine's population, which was only 5%. The point was here that despite their percentages, the number of Jews who became Bolsheviks was still small, less than 1% of the group as a whole. On the other hand, it's also true that Jews, or more properly, atheists of Jewish background, so contradiction in terms, non-Jewish Jews, were very prominent in the highest levels of the All-Russian Bolshevik Party. For instance, in 1917, these Jews comprised 20% of the delegates at the Bolshevik Party Congress, while 6 of the 21 members of the party's Central Committee were Jewish. This disproportionate Jewish presence in the early years of the Soviet regime gave rise to the popular image of the Zhydokomuna. The Zhydokomuna, which I guess the Jewish society, what in popular terms came to be known as the Jewish Communist Conspiracy, and that this was what allegedly made it possible for the Bolsheviks to rule Ukraine. This stereotypical belief in Jewish Bolshevism, or Zhydo-Bolshevism, continued for decades to dominate attitudes among the ever-increasing number of people in Ukraine who became opposed to Soviet rule. As a national, but not religious minority, they were classified as a national minority, not as a religious minority, Jews were entitled to self-government. And so by 1930, they had in Soviet Ukraine 3 nationality districts, which we can see on your map, the green on your map. Almost all 3 of them are in the southern part of Ukraine. There were also 2 more nationality districts set up in the 1930s. Yiddish, in particular, was to experience a renaissance after 1923. This is this Germanic dialect, which was spoken by Ashkenazi Jews, of which the vast majority of Jews in Ukraine were. And so it was given support when the policy of indigenization, that is, rooting the party, was implemented in Soviet Ukraine. Ukrainianization, one aspect of that. So now, in keeping with the Communist Party's new emphasis on promoting local languages, but still continuing to reject Hebrew because of its intimate association with the Jewish religion. Hebrew and Yiddish are not the same thing. Hebrew is a Semitic language. It's the language of religion. Yiddish is the spoken language, which is actually a Germanic dialect. So Yiddish was okay, Hebrew was bad. And so Bolshevik ideologues promoted the Yiddish language. Actually, it was 76% of all Jews spoke Yiddish still. And why? Because this would be the instrument through which a new Jewish proletarian culture could be created. And in a sense, to create new Soviet Jews, a Yiddish language school system was established. It created 4 pedagogical institutes, an Institute of People's Education in Odessa. High point in 1931 with 1,096 schools at all levels, serving nearly 95,000 students. There was even a Jewish Historical and Archaeographical Commission specifically set up at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. Other institutions founded not only to preserve Jewish culture, but also made its achievements available to the larger public. So we have a central Jewish library in Kiev, a state Yiddish theater system in various parts of Ukraine. Now, following the Stalinist Revolution of 1928, because what I've just described parallels in many ways the Ukrainianization process, but after the Stalinist Revolution of 1928 and the transition to a more centralized and integrated Soviet Union, Jewish cultural achievements like those intended for ethnic Ukrainians began to be dismantled. Jews who owned small businesses and factories that were allowed during the new economic policy were now deprived of that livelihood when the new economic policy was declared ended effectively in 1928. And at the same time, forced collectivization and the liquidation of the kulaks put an abrupt halt to movement into rural areas. No one wants to go to rural areas anymore. And of the Jewish agriculturalists who survived collectivization and the famine, many returned to live in cities. In political and cultural life, Jewish activists were persecuted at the same time and in the same way as other intellectuals in Soviet Ukraine who were, by the 1930s, suspected of nationalist deviation, bourgeois nationalism. And so in 1930, the Jewish section of the Communist Party Bolshevik of Ukraine, set up specifically to root the party, it was dissolved. Most of its leaders were purged from the party. The following years witnessed the closing or curtailment of many Jewish institutions, with the result that by 1930s there were only 5 Yiddish newspapers, only 4 theaters, and a decrease by nearly half in the number of students in Yiddish language schools. And so, to sum up this section, the favorable environment for Jewish culture in Soviet Ukraine that prevailed in the 1920s, albeit in a secular, anti-religious Yiddish form, even that was largely undermined by the end of the 1930s.